Dan, welcome back to the Gymnastics Growth Show.
Hey, how are we doing?
Good. This is our first one-to-one in person.
I know, yeah. New studio, looks amazing.
Yeah. How many times have you been on the pod?
Ooh, 4.
4.
Yeah, I was having to think on the drive in.
Not including the group pod.
Yeah,
One of those will be out before.
Yeah, I think 4. I was thinking about my first one, which is when I just started my consultancy. And then I think I've probably had 2 more since.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is number 4, but
you're a veteran, mate, for podcasts now. You've been on quite a few other, guests of other people's, haven't you?
Yeah. I think people are getting sick of it, really. I don't know, just yet.
I don't know about that. You know what? I think I've done a few like this.
Yeah.
In person, one-to-one. It's just totally different.
Yeah.
From a host, let's call me a host in a scenario. It's totally different.
Yeah.
It's such a natural way of having a conversation.
Yeah.
Well, which is obvious because we're in person.
Of course,
but when you're online, it's just those little bits of friction. There's like the small delay. There's just all sorts of things. It's just not the same. I love this.
Yeah, it's cool. We did our first one like this, didn't we? But it just wasn't recorded visually.
Yes, you're right. And that was back in the day when I just had a little recorder on my table. That was...
But we did it like this, and it does feel different when you're doing it in person. And
I think so.
I think we've sort of commented on it, haven't we? That like it's how you have these conversations quite a bit anyway, but they're just not recorded.
Yeah, and the amount of times that we've said, geez, if we just had recorded that conversation.
Yeah.
Because we talk about this stuff a lot.
Yeah.
And today we're going to go a bit deeper into specifics, really, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think we've skirted around S&C for quite a few times. We've talked about why it's important, why people should integrate it into a program, what that might look like, what are the foundations, and how you would go about starting that process. But actually, I think it's time we actually just talk and show the level of S&C which you're providing, and that someone like me would leverage in a performance coaching environment, whether that's a club or working with a federation, because it's not just it's maybe there's a bit of fatigue with this, which is like, do some lunges and squats.
Yeah.
And like, we all know that's important, but it really kind of scratches the surface of the world that you exist in and work in.
Yeah.
And really, I think we're still scratching the surface of the way that S&C is integrated into gymnastics. Yeah. And contrary to popular belief, S&C has been integrated in gymnastics for a long time, but it has not really, I don't think, been integrated at club level for a long time. So, this stuff's not new to NGBs or NOCs, whatever you refer to it as.
Not at all.
But maybe that information diluting down to your average club coach that's working with a set of gymnasts, I think that's probably where things have been quite new. Yeah,
I would say so. I think it's nice that we can move the conversation along because for the longest time, the conversations we've been having have been super, super necessary of making sure that you're doing this, making sure it's part of your week, making sure it's structured. I think all of those things were needed. Exercise selection, discussing certain exercises. I think for the longest time, I think that was the required conversation at that club level. Like you said, at NGB Federation level, those guys have their S&C coaches who are working with those athletes in that detail because that's the name of the game.
Yeah, and they're performance athletes.
Absolutely, yeah absolutely. Where has the trickle down maybe been coming down to that level? No. Has it been applied at that level? Certainly not.
Yeah.
Which is hence why
it is a different world, though. I mean, high performance. It's not just a few extra reps and a slightly more talented kid and a slightly more like when you're actually getting it right. It's different. Yeah. It's very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like everything around the athlete, the way that things are managed, the focus on the schedule, I guess the scrutiny of certain performance standards, it is very different. And that's why I think if you haven't been in that environment, it's really difficult to understand. Yeah. I mean, how can you have the standards, the expectations and the know-how of what to do if you haven't ever been in one of those environments before?
Yeah, exactly. And it's, you don't know, you haven't had exposure to it, you haven't had the discussions, you haven't seen, it's just problem solving at its finest at that level as well of for that individual, what's the best way? Like whether that's physical, technical, or like you said, the rest of all of the other things that go into those, high performance athletes.
That's why things like this are important. So podcasts, and obviously we're not the only ones doing this.
Nope.
Fortunately, and there's great content. And also I think, again, NGBs or NOCs, for those that aren't aware there, we're talking about national governing bodies or national organising committees, essentially federations, like the opportunities that they create for club coaches to delve into the world of high performance. And that might be watching a national team training session, or it might be being put in front of the medical team, the sports science and medicine, personnel, so they can actually get that knowledge.
Yeah.
We shouldn't ring fence it and go, well, unless you're at this level, you can't access the knowledge. I'm a big believer in let's get the information at top level into the clubs so that actually we can get more people.
Absolutely. Like same here. So like that is something that I see like fundamentally as what I'm trying to do or have been doing for a while, really, is like having those discussions about the information, about the detail, about the why, like with the club at the club level, because it is still super needed.
Yeah.
Like it's not like once you hit that certain point, you then need this new magical, you haven't unlocked a new level.
Yeah.
You're still working with people who have high physical demands, and that level of knowledge is needed. But if you don't know the why, you kind of just plucking things out best you can, and it comes from goodwill. But actually, people are getting lost in the weeds of it because it's
complex, isn't it?
It can be.
I think the beauty of this is, though, so the strength and conditioning world is always evolving.
Yes.
I mean,
hugely.
You'll know this far better than I do, but if you think about some of the methods from even a decade ago, which were cutting edge then, and now there might even be a new research paper or science. So actually, that's probably not the most effective way of doing things. Right, 10 years ago it was great, but now we're moving on to this. And I guess when science improves, what I'm trying to say here is that you can never reach top level S&C and go, right, I know what I need to do now to produce an athlete, because the demands will change. Science changes, our knowledge changes.
Huge. And there's like a high requirement on us to constantly be continually developing as well.
Yeah.
So when it comes to that tech side of things, or whether it's the knowledge side or the latest research, in order for me to keep my qualification, I have to show that I am actually continually developing, and it gets reviewed every 2 years. I have a CPD cycle.
With points and things like that.
Yeah. And that is because it is ever changing. So you have to stay abreast of it. It doesn't mean they have to be applying these things all the time, but it's making sure that you are staying on top of what is coming out, or what are the best methods, or have something been shown to be more effective, or could you use something that is more efficient to your training as opposed to the other ways. It doesn't mean that the basics are long gone. We're still using them. Those are the fundamentals, very similar to probably gymnastics. Is those fundamental principles that you will always use, but it's making sure that you're abreast of all the other stuff that are coming out all the time, so you can help your athletes and ultimately help support the coaches better.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah.
So if we're going to delve into some content here, I guess one of the more interesting conversations we've had of late, and I know we have many.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed us talking about isometrics the other day. I don't know, I can't remember how we got onto that. I think we were talking about stiffness.
Yes.
Stiffness is obviously something that I've been speaking about for a long time. It falls under my acrobatic principles.
Yeah.
So for the audience that aren't familiar with some of my learning concepts, the 4 acrobatic principles that I would talk about is the importance of shape, speed, stiffness, and sight. And I think if you don't have any one of those principles, it really compromises the ability, or the athlete's ability, to perform well.
Yeah.
Stiffness is an interesting one because and again, to define that, my interpretation of stiffness is the athlete's ability to be more rigid than the surface they're contacting. So if it was a lower limb activity, such as a takeoff, so let's say a front somersault on floor, for example, the athlete their leg tension needs to be stiffer than the floor.
Yeah.
Young kids will find that very difficult because they don't have enough strength ultimately to do that. So therefore the floor is a stiffer surface. The kids collapse their knees, they leak energy into the floor. Whereas if you put them on a trampoline, of course, they're actually, even at a young age, able to be stiffer than that surface. A high level example of lower limb stiffness would be contacting the springboard in a Yurchenko. So at max velocity, or at least maybe not max velocity, but a high velocity.
High velocity.
And not collapsing the knees and the ankle and the hip into the springboard. So that would be a key example of lower limb stiffness. If we talk about upper body stiffness, because the stiffness obviously occurs in upper body, you can still use the Yurchenko example. So you're reaching back into a table, you're having to what we call block. If there is a lack of stiffness in the upper body, either through the elbow or through the shoulders or even through the rib cage, collapsing and hinging there, lower back, then again, the apparatus doesn't offer energy, it steals energy. And we say leak energy, don't we?
We say leak,
So they've leaked energy. Whereas if the athlete is stiffer than the surface, then they will be able to convert energy, essentially. They will be able to use the energy and leverage the energy that the apparatus provides. So that's what stiffness is.
Yes.
And we were, I guess, getting into the weeds about how do we develop that in a really efficient and effective way.
Yeah.
Because there's the obvious stuff, which I think is a low-hanging fruit, is, can the athlete show basic shapes? Let's say a basic isometric hold still. Could be a straight line, could be a prone hold, a plank. Could be pogos across the floor, sort of small lower limb rebounds, could be handstand bounces on the floor. Now, all of that stuff is probably very common throughout a lot of technical programs. It's the bread and butter of what we do, quite rightly. However, I think if you're looking at the forces on the body through a pogo, so, and again, got to be careful of using language here that maybe not everyone's familiar with. So a pogo is basically just mini rebound jumps, across the floor. If the athlete, when the athlete's doing that, the level of force on the body is actually minimal, really, isn't it? There's not an awful lot.
Yeah.
If you compare that to then the forces that an athlete would experience if they're vaulting at, let's say something like 6 meters per second, they're running, so quite fast for a gymnast. For a gymnast, they're smashing into a stiff springboard. Through a technical skill and trying to create as much energy from that springboard, that's incomparable to a small pogo on the floor area. And maybe you've done this, but it'll be interesting to look at the force being applied on a springboard in Yurchenko and see how that compares to. It wouldn't be a counter movement jump, would it? What would you call that? A drop? No, not a drop.
Yeah, sort of drop jumping or counter movement jumping.
The plyo version, and not...
so lower level plyometric work. What's the difference between doing little rebounds compared to a run and a vault? I think there's been some research done where obviously they're looking at the sort of the amount of force going through your body. I don't know whether that's come off the springboard or not, but basically you're looking like into the high 20s, right? Like it's such like 20 times your body weight.
It's enormous.
It's huge. It's huge. It's so physically demanding. And like you said, that's not just being able to cope with it. It's being able to cope with it and express on the other side of it shape and speed and sight, like all the other sides of the acrobatic principles that you have. And it's, like you said, it's the things that we're going to talk about, potentially these isometrics, is we're not discounting that you don't need to be ungodly strong in order to do that. What we're doing, I think, is probably assuming that work is being done, which is amazing. It's like, how do we then start to maybe solve the performance problem a little bit further, a little bit deeper? So we've got a really strong athlete. How do we get them to be able to create stiffness in the way that we want, that allows them to, for example, if we take an example of your ankles not collapsing when you hit the springboard, it's like if their ankles don't collapse, what happens on the other side of it is basically they can then fire off the rest of the chain above that. So posterior chain, so calf, hamstrings, glutes, everything that then allows them to get into the shape that they need to get onto the board, which then obviously the next bit of stiffness comes into.
It's that domino effect, isn't it?
Yeah, where if we go on the other side of it, unfortunately, where the ankle does collapse, we normally see the energy that's comes shooting up, so probably knees collapsing.
Yeah, you can't really flex at the ankle without flexing at the knee and therefore the hip as well.
And then you're back. Which then obviously leads to another discussion as well.
All sorts of. And I think let's say as a technical coach, a lot of the language or the corrections, the feedback that we provide the athletes is basically as a result of lacking stiffness. So we would say, don't bend your legs on the springboard, like rightly or wrongly, but we hear that language a lot. Don't bend your arms on the vault, which, for me, again, is a result of them being too low onto the table. They can't achieve stiffness at those angles. But I think if we address that sometimes and think like, okay, what have I actually just said there? It was essentially, I need you to be stiffer. Be stiffer. Like, how do we create more tension with that? And I'm obviously interested in not the low level stuff. I mean, that's important. But when I'm working with an athlete that's trying to do an Aminar, Yurchenko with 2.5 twists, right at the top level, these are the let's call them subtle differences in what you see. But actually what that athlete is capable of doing is entirely different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hitting a springboard and getting off that springboard much quicker, like half a second quicker. It's going to be more than less. As a result of having extra tension and not having to wait for the knees to go through flexion and then back into extension again, because
exactly.
They don't have to go through that journey.
It's like, feels like a rebound rather than a push.
Yeah, it's a rebound instead of a jump.
Is the way I've always sort of kind of spoken to my gymnasts about it that I work with. It's like, you want to be rebounding. You don't want to turn it into this like event of pushes. Yeah. Because otherwise, the longer you're on the floor, the more of a muscular action that becomes, rather than it being stored energy and released energy. And
now it's not plyo at all, is it? So. And you're obviously very familiar with the octagon, of course. And and I often say that the first two segments there you've got are a squat pattern. So jumping and landing is the first one, jumping and landing. And the second one is rebounding. And the athlete is never doing a blend of them. They're either doing one or the other. Yeah. So you don't jump with a rebound action. You don't rebound through it. Like, it's either one or the other. And the athlete has to be able to differentiate that. And we see that mistake happening, particularly on stiff surfaces. So take a beam dismount.
Yes.
A beam is one of the stiffest surfaces that an athlete will ever have to rebound off on lower limb.
Unforgiving.
Well, it probably is the stiffest surface. Yeah, very unforgiving. It's not going to give anything, or very little. And so what we tend to see with young athletes trying to do like a round off somersault dismount is they will collapse the knee and they will very much bend the legs and push them straight. Or whilst their legs are bending, their back's being arched and they're going to throw themselves backwards because they physically don't have the physical qualities or competency to rebound off a surface which is that stiff. Yeah. It's massive.
Yeah. And then that's when my cogs start turning, really. So like when you are working closely with the coach and you're like, this isn't all technical. You're like, okay, maybe there are some physical things we can put in place. And I think that's where our discussion of isometrics came from, really, which was, how do we create more stiffness? So should we get into it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we should get into it and try and understand, how do we safely expose athletes to high levels of force through isometric training, which is kind of more comparable to what they actually need. And I think we do need to put a bit of a disclaimer here that you've got to earn the right to do any of this stuff, because ultimately if the kids are physically underdeveloped, if they maybe haven't gone through maturation yet, if they're not exposed to these forces, then safely, then obviously there could be the risk of harm. Yeah. So, I guess the question is, how can we do that safely? Yeah. So practically. Yeah, like you said, there's an element of earning it, like in anything, whether that's technical or physical, right? You have to be in a position to do that. But then, let's start to get into it. So basically, from an isometric muscle contraction, okay, so you have three muscular contractions. You have a concentric, which is if I bend my arm, this muscle becomes shorter. Which muscle's that then?
My bicep.
This big bicep you got there.
Behave yourself. And then if I straighten my arm, it then lengthens. Okay, so then I've got a muscular action, which is eccentric in the sense of it is lengthening under tension. There's also a third one, right, which is if I am having to contract my muscle without an eccentric or concentric, it's classed as isometric, which means there's no movement. If we're going to put it really purely, which let's do that for simplicity's sake. Cool. So when we think of that, of like, we don't want that ankle to flex, there are a couple of ways that spring to mind. Making sure you're strong, yes. But also, actually, if we start to train you isometrically, there's ways where we can actually help develop your force output and how quickly you produce it through isometric training. And there's two types, basically. So there is a yielding isometric. And basically the way to think of that is when you are pushing against an external force, i.e. a weight, and you're creating enough force in the opposite direction, so you're holding still. All right. So that force is trying to, for example, if I was doing a hip bridge and I was trying to hold the top of that hip bridge on a weight, I would have to obviously produce an opposite force, and that weight is trying to pull me back down to earth.
So gravity's doing its bit to pull down. You're having to use your glutes, your lower back to push up,
to extend.
And the top hold where where you're not moving up and down
is called like a yielding
isometric.
Because and then that is basically seen as like a resisting of eccentric, because that weight's trying to pull me down. Okay, so when we start to look at that ankle dropping, that's what that is, isn't it? Is we want to resist that eccentric action of the ankle a lot harder when you're doing a Yurchenko than a hip thrust, depending on the weight on the bar, of course, right? But you can do that with calf raises and all sorts. I'm sure we'll get into it. The second isometric that you have is a overcoming isometric, okay? And the way to think of that is where you are flexing and extending against an immovable object. So if I was to give you an example, you have 400 kilos on a bar at your knee, and I ask you to try and pick it up and complete the rest of the deadlift. I would like to think I'd be pretty surprised if you picked it up, where you would be pulling as hard as you could against that weight in order to try and extend your hips, but it wouldn't move because it's 400 kilos.
Yeah.
And that is an isometric action, basically, where you are having to fight. So that's a failed concentric action, isn't it? Because the concentric action of a deadlift action would be that you would stand up and fully extend your hips.
Yeah, but you don't ever complete the action because you physically can't.
Yeah.
And
that's called overcoming.
Overcoming. So we've got overcoming and yielding.
Yes, those are the words we're going to use. There's two other ones for this.
Okay, I do like, it's important that hopefully everyone can just kind of stay with us with those two examples there. So my first thing I think of is, so if I was to go to the gym now, I was at the gym this morning. You'll be proud of me, Dan.
Well done.
I wasn't trying to lift 400 kilos this morning. I'll do that next week. Okay. But let's say I did try and lift 400 kilos. There's a good chance that I would just get injured.
Probably.
So oh God.
No comment.
You know what? I need to edit some of these comments out of these podcasts.
Cut that.
I just drop myself in these things. But on a serious note, so what is the difference between like me trying to move in immovable objects and actually getting injured and it being a performance enhancing exercise? Like who has earned the right to try and do that? Yeah,
you've got to be strong. So you've got to have really good levels of being able to produce force already.
That's me out then.
Right. You have got to have competency on the exercise. So you've got to be able to hold your posture in a neutral spine, be able to brace, so it's not like you're pushing down and your spine is just bending and bending and bending. You've got to be able to have postural integrity, we call it. So you're pulling on the bar as hard as you can and you're staying strong from a postural point of view.
Compromising your shape.
Because if we're doing that with big flexion, you are just leading yourself down a slippery road. Obviously, that's all very relative as well, right? So we wouldn't need a 400 kilogram thing on the bar for an athlete not to be able to lift it who is potentially 15, 16, 17. It all depends on your strength levels.
But if the object didn't need to move, does it actually matter? For example, because it could be 1 ton.
Yeah.
The whole point of the exercise is that it doesn't move anyway. So
Or you could be pulling it into the rack that doesn't move, for example.
Okay.
So it doesn't even have to be weights on the bar. It could be...
so you've got a bar on its own.
Yeah, and you pull it up into the safety pins of a rack is another way of doing it, right? So it totally depends on the setup of the exercise that you're using. So the one I described about that half deadlift, for example, S&C coaches refer to that as a mid-thigh pull.
So we talked about mid-thigh pulls.
Yeah, and that is actually one isometric that has been shown in research in gymnastics.
Yeah.
So for vaulting performance, they relate very closely. If you have very good high mid-thigh pull scores on a force plate, for example, they have correlated that to actually being successful at vault.
Where's the force plate?
Under your feet. So when you're standing up, you're pressing your feet into the floor, you're pressing the plate down, it's giving us readings.
Okay, that's nice measurable data that you can use.
Exactly, and that's the thing with those overcoming isometrics is you normally need that measurable data a lot of the time, but obviously you can also just use your common sense a little bit and go like, we're not getting the data, but as long as we're being sensible. The yielding on the other side of it is a little bit less research, but used more in coaching.
Right.
Because of the ease of use, trying to do a hip bridge, with one leg with a 15 kilogram plate on your hips.
Yeah.
And you're resisting it, it's easier to set up, isn't it? It's easier to do across a squat. It's easier to change, the weights per athlete as opposed to trying to change the height of the bar for every single person that comes up to that mid-thigh pull. It becomes a bit of a long process.
Short interruption. If you're a head coach, club owner, manager, or leader, check out our high performance health check for a free insight into how well your club's operating within our 6-category framework. Head to nickroddick.com/health check to take our 10-minute assessment. We'll send you the results straight to your inbox. Back to the episode.
I wonder in gymnastics, like we're very good at shape, and maybe this was one of the things that when you first started in gymnastics, which was we worked this out as being over 12 years ago now.
A while ago.
When we started
12,
together.
Yeah.
Wow. Gymnastics coaches are remarkably good at getting their athletes into aesthetic sport-specific positions.
Absolutely.
Hollows, arches,
Yep.
dish, straight lines,
Yep.
like the sport-specific positions.
Yes.
For me, I feel that, and we've talked about this a lot, it's represented on the octagon. There's a difference between shape and strength. So
Yes.
you can have kids that can achieve very nice lines.
Yep.
We use that terminology, of course. But just because it's a nice line, it's aesthetic, it meets the sports requirements, doesn't mean it's a strong shape.
Nope.
I wonder whether we don't do enough work on actually developing the strength of those positions. So, I mean, even doing a prone hold for 30 seconds is pretty easy considering like the comparable forces which are on the body.
Yeah.
We obviously talk a lot about strength at length, don't we?
Yeah,
And how you can challenge the core and therefore the stiffness of the position when the body's at its longest, because the core won't fail typically when the body's in a very small shape. So if a kid's in a pike position doing a leg lift or doing a V-sit, or they're in a tuck position, technically doing a double back, the core's never going to fail when the body shortens, but when it's the body's lengthening or it's at its full length. And so that is when they are contacting the dismount, the beam dismount in a round off layout or straight back, or maybe they're doing a Yurchenko and they're contacting the board, it's a very extended position. Or doing a backward giant when they're trying to get the toes over.
Yes.
Because essentially that's the longest, a straight line is the longest position that a gymnast can actually physically get into. You can't be longer than a straight line with your arms above your head.
Yeah, of course.
And I wonder whether, I don't even wonder, I know we don't do enough. I go, right, now you've made the shape and it looks good and you've got nice lines. How strong are you in that position? And is it transferable over to the fact that I'm trying to get you to do a double layout here? Or I'm trying to get you to do a double twisting Yurchenko. And that is not the same as lying on the floor in a straight line with beautiful shape.
No. And I think there's like building capacity in those shapes, isn't it? Being able to endure that shape for a long time. One cements it from a coaching point of view, probably as like motor learning, you're learning the shape over and over. From a physical point of view, you're building more endurance or capacity in that shape. But like you said, there comes a point where that shape is going to be stressed beyond belief. Are you able to overcome, or are you able to overcome the forces acting on the body in that shape in order for you to continue to do it in a dynamic fashion? Or does it fail? And is there a point of failure? And what I mean by that is you don't fall off the bar, but your elbows bend, you lose your shape, you arch your back, whatever that may be. And then I think that's when the role of the S&C coach comes back into the conversation of, she can make this great shape, but then when we do X, Y, or Z, we're seeing this, and give the coach the problem to go away with and maybe come back to some solutions. And then that's where I think our conversation started, really, was with the tumbling in the ankle on the floor. Was we don't want the ankle to be dropping all the time because we want the stiffness. How do you do that? And it was like, well, actually, if you use some of these isometrics, maybe this is something that we could start to implement with, the gymnasts that we were discussing that would improve.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned capacity there, because again, coming back to the octagon, and I think for anyone that's listening that wants a copy of the octagon, just send me a message. If you're watching this on YouTube, of course, just write in. Can you send me that? And I'll need your email address. So just maybe ping it over to us at NR HQ. Happily send you our learning models and our PDF. But the octagon obviously has, in terms of the 8 competencies, we've got the 8 movements, we've got the 8 competencies. We've talked about shape, which is represented in form on the octagon. We've got stiffness, which we've talked about, and capacity is one of the other 8 sort of competencies as well, which is interesting that we're referencing those. Strength being another one. So again, we're trying to say here is just because a gymnast can make a nice shape doesn't mean they're strong in that shape. Doesn't mean they can hold that shape by going over it over and over again through capacity. And so if we think of a different example, can an athlete open their shoulders effectively? So that's represented through mobility on the octagon. And therefore that impacts form. Maybe they can open their shoulders nicely and they'll represent that, or they'll do that in a kip caster handstand, upstart caster handstand. And if they can do that once, actually, can they do that at the end of a bar routine where they've opened their shoulders 10 times already and now they're under fatigue? That will be the capacity part of that. But what about doing it in a shaposhnikova, or a kachev? So now they're having to open the shoulders with force. That's represented as tempo on the octagon, because again, that's entirely different, being able to open your shoulders quickly than it is doing it 10 times.
Doing this.
Just lifting your arms up, for example. And so we've got to understand that not all physical competencies are the same. We throw the word strong. She's strong. Well, yeah, okay. She's strong at what?
At what?
At
Exactly.
a static position, or just 'cause she's got abs, does that make her strong?
Yeah. And I think these are the discussions we have of like, you need to be strong in the way that is demanding for your sport, and that differs for all sports. It differs for all athletes, depending as well. And that's sometimes a little bit of a frustration, isn't it? Of like, it's such a general term. And I think if we started to dig into like, where do we have to be strong? Why do we have to be strong in that? I think it then allows you to start to go down the topic of this, like, well, in this case, isometrics. It's like, we've got an athlete that is collapsing when they're, hitting the board through their knees. Or we've got an athlete that is collapsing through the ankle when they're tumbling. That is a lot better, isn't it? Because it's like, okay, yes, they are strong, but we've clearly still got a limitation there that we need to look at. So they're strong, but they're not strong for what they need to be doing.
Yeah, and it's identifying where that weak point is in the chain, isn't it?
Yes.
Because I mean, really, if we're thinking of lower limb, that's going to go all the way up to the lower back.
Yeah.
So you've got lower back, obvious hinge point, and
absolute hinge point.
A massive point of instability for a lot of gymnasts. Weak posture is going to affect how stiff that position is and how strong it is. So if they're lordotic, if the hip is moved into like a APT or anterior pelvic tilt, that weakens that chain straight away.
Yeah.
Now the glutes aren't firing, so it's massive.
Yes.
Coming down that chain from the lower back. Obviously, we've got apart from the control of the pelvis, you've then got knee and ankle as well, and there's just so much in that.
Yes.
And I think the higher performance level I've coached at, the more high performing environments, the higher level athletes I've worked at, the more you have these revelations and you go, my God, it's all about the pelvis. And then you go, my God, it's all about the ankle. My God, it's all about the core. And you have these revelations and you start to realize that all of it's important.
Yes.
And if you're truly going to have strength and an athlete that's robust and can tolerate these forces, you can't have any weak points in the chain. No. But they all do. And that's where the job is never done.
That's probably where the revelation comes from for you as well. Is like you're probably discussing gymnast A and then you're discussing gymnast B in a different place. And then like you're saying, you're like, oh my God, like this is so important on this side. But that's because that's what the athlete probably has been identified from her team or her support team of like, actually, this is an area of weakness. We need to try and develop this to get you through. And then athlete B has a completely different area.
Yeah, for them, it's all about something else.
And it's all about that because that's the thing we're chasing that's going to make the difference compared to making sure we're doing everything that I can imagine 3/4 of the gymnasts are doing.
Sure.
So they have strong legs, they have a strong posterior chain, they have good calf strength, the basics.
Yeah.
So it's this, the use of this isometric work is interesting. It's something I've been playing around with as well. So at the clubs that I'm working at. So to give you an example, when we're trying to avoid ankle collapse, so we're trying to have a stiff ankle so the rest of the chain can fire when we're tumbling or when we are what we call like mid-stance sprinting. So when you see a gymnast that is running and they've done the acceleration phase and they're upright running, you want that foot to be striking the floor, remaining stiff and coming off the floor. Sometimes what we see is the very opposite in the sense of the foot is flat on the floor and hip height is dropping. So I've gone away and looked at that and gone, actually, maybe we can start to use some of these yielding isometrics, which are the ones where you're trying to overcome that eccentric action of the heel drop more. So I'm using something like very, very simple, which is the athlete's body weight, split squat on a beam with like a big knee flexion, so knee over toe, chest over that knee, and they're holding half a calf raise because that is a yielding isometric because that gymnast is having to hold that position for a given amount of time, making sure that they can create the strength in that joint at that given angle. And that's something that I've been playing around with and sort of, it started really simply like that. And then it's like expanded like any other idea that you sort of have of like, maybe this is a solution for, that foot slamming into the floor during that mid-stance running or that really excessive heel drop or collapse when they're tumbling.
Yeah, and what's interesting is obviously the more force the athlete exerts through the movement, the more challenging it is for them to resist those forces.
Yeah.
So we would see this with, I guess, even kids that have just got really good genetics.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that they're able to control the movement. No. They might just be...
Great genetics.
Yeah, very twitchy. very like they're explosive, and it's not the dream, and you've got the dream raw resource, but you might not be able to express that in a safe way.
Yes.
And we've talked about this before about like it's all well and good being able to jump, but then you've got to be able to land. It's like having a Ferrari that you floor with no brakes. So if this, let's say it's a young athlete, for example, and you're getting them to run fast, well, that's fantastic. They can create that speed.
It's wicked.
Yeah, but then they've got to then, like, the more velocity they create, the more force they're basically expressing into the floor, the more challenging it is for them to be able to resist those forces at the same time. And bless the gymnasts that have not got those genetics that really have to work so hard. But essentially, because they're quite leaky, you know, they don't have the same level of stiffness. Spongy. They can't, they're spongy. They are working really, really hard, but actually every step that they take, they're just leaking energy every single time. And it's like, it's really hard for them to get going. And that's why stiffness is really important for those athletes that are not very twitchy as well.
And that's where the solution comes in, because it's beautiful, isn't it? You've got that fast twitch athlete, that big ball of clay that you kind of want to work with at the beginning, right? They've got everything you need. You just kind of have to refine it all. But then on the other side, you've got that gymnast that is the worker, and they're going to have to do the work. But by using that simple split squat, for example, you can be allowing them to be able to cope with more force and create more strength, because that's the beauty of an isometric, as it has been shown to improve the amount of force you produce. So very similar to strength training, it can actually get you stronger. It can improve the speed at which you do that, depending on the method of isometric you've used. And it, like you said, fighting that eccentric. So it's a win-win, because you can potentially add a little bit of load to the gymnast that can produce a little bit more velocity. The one that isn't producing the velocity that you want can manage their body weight better. So that ankle isn't collapsing under them. And it's something as simple as like a 20, 30 second hold in that case, that you're seeing the improvement. You're seeing a visual improvement. And then in my mind, I start to think then actually we're starting to have a role in improving that gymnast at that level for what they need to be doing, which is approaching the vault with a better run, with more velocity, being able to cope with whatever happens at the end of that run through their ankles and therefore their knees and their hips. And that's for both of those athletes that you see at a club level as well, which is the genetically gifted ones and the ones that are going to have to be doing the work to get a little bit stronger as well.
To fill those gaps.
And they both need the help.
How important is concentric and eccentric strength in good isometric positions? So like, just based on what you just said there, some coaches might be listening and go, well, I'm going to replace a lot of the concentric work that I'm doing because it sounds like isometrics are important. But am I right in saying that the concentric and eccentric work is basically important to even apply this isometric stuff in the first place?
Fundamentally. So don't take this as me being like, this is a new thing, bin it all off. You have to have the ability to produce large amounts of force. You have to
the first place.
And that is concentrically, i.e. doing some squatting, split squatting, hip bridge, whatever that may be. Eccentrically, whether that's doing your slider works, your Nordics, your tempo work on your squatting. So it's keeping that strength in there. It's fundamental for the sport.
And it supports the isometric as well.
And the more you have that, the more it lends itself to then being a really powerful tool that you can use. And isometrics have been, they're not a new thing. They've been used for the longest of time, and they've actually been really heavily researched. But,
and they're used in gymnastics already. You know, we see a lot of coaches doing static positions. But again, what we're trying to do here is go, there's another level to this. It doesn't need to just be a hollow position or a plank for
scratching
30
the
seconds.
surface.
That's very basic foundational level isometrics, but there's a lot more to this if coaches want to explore it with the right athletes.
And with the right sort of framework of decision making there as well. So there's a performance problem. How are we going to solve it? Is this applicable? Yes. Okay, cool. Which one is most applicable, whether it's overcoming or yielding? So do we need the athlete to accelerate faster? I'm going to use something like that overcoming, where you are having to basically generate large amounts of concentric that don't happen, and you create that isometric. Or is it, we're looking at this collapsing sort of issue where we're going to maybe bias ourselves toward that yielding, and we're going to use some of those things where we are pushing up and resisting and holding. for a length of time. The key thing with it as well is making sure it's an isometric with that yielding stuff. From the things I've read, is making sure it's not an isometric that doesn't fail. So we're not holding those calf raises till failure.
Right.
Because obviously then when it fails, what happens is you actually start to get an eccentric action.
Yeah, because it drops, yeah.
And then that can induce a lot of fatigue in your athlete. So
soreness.
So, you see shorter time frames for the overcoming stuff where you're pulling on a bar as hard as you can, like you're trying to rip a tree out the floor. But then you also, for the yielding, think of it as a quality movement. Don't see it as like let's see how long we can hold this for.
And we can fall into that trap as gymnastics coaches, don't we? Yes, as we know. Let's come back to exercise selection.
Cool.
So if I think about some examples that I've done, I think probably a yielding exercise was to have a collection of heavy elastics.
Cool.
A gymnast will be standing, and the elastics will be on their across their shoulders. So essentially, rather than using a barbell, they would be standing and pushing their legs straight up against the elastics, which are pushing down. And I've done that in order to try and replicate the forces which are pushing down when they contact the springboard on a Yurchenko, if that makes sense. That'll be a yielding exercise.
Yeah, and they're having to overcome that to hold that isometric shape.
Exactly.
Yes, yielding.
I've also done that with much less resistance, but overhead. So this time the elastics are in the hands. The anchor points might be on the floor. They stand with their arms up. So essentially... standing up with the arms by their ears. So it's an inverted handstand, and they're trying to resist against the forces again. But because the body's in such a long position there, especially if they hold that on their toes, that's really good for core strength as well. But there's not a massive amount of resistance there, but they still are having to overcome the elastic and things, or the heel dropping.
Yeah, so that's a really good example. If I go down that upper body route, what have I been using recently? So things that I play around with. We've been doing some like kneeling, very like overhead. So they basically start kneeling with their hands over their head and they're just nearly about to press it out. And then they press up into the bar as hard as they can. A bar that is on a rack that isn't going to move, for example. And it's safe because it's got on safety pins that have been...
When you say kneeling, are they kneeling up or sat on...
So kneeling up, and their arms are nearly fully flexed, shoulders are nearly fully extended, and then they push on that bar as hard as they can for 5 seconds, like they're trying to lift the roof off the building.
Yeah.
And that's a similar thing. So we're looking at like, yes, the whole chain is having to work, but we're getting that like overcoming isometric. We do it for 5 seconds, 3 seconds, depending, and it's like 100% effort when they're doing
Is the breathing difficult for those? Because they're bracing so much.
Yeah, you take a breath in, you don't breathe.
You don't. Okay, so take a breath in, brace, of course.
Push hard.
Apply that force.
Yeah.
And then it's only for 3 seconds.
And
and
you're encouraged. So from a coaching, so how do you develop that from a coaching point of view? You're being encouraging, usually in a louder manner, because you're asking them to push against something that isn't moving or pull against something that isn't moving. Try it and see how much encouragement you would probably need. The yielding is a little bit different, right? Because you're still encouraging, but it's not the same level. You're not trying to lift a car off someone in your mind. You're holding a position against a weight that actually at any point you could sit down and stop as well.
Yeah, love this stuff.
Yeah, it's class, isn't it? The yielding, a really good example of a yielding is a single leg hip bridge where your back is on a block, your heel is on a block, and there's a gap in between. And you do a single leg hip bridge and you would hold a weight on your hip and you would keep yourself in extension for as long as you can in that long lever hip bridge position. And it's called a hamstring isometric, like a running iso. And you would hold it for as long as you can, like for the given period of 10, 15, 20 seconds with a little weight on your hip.
And the support leg's bent.
Yeah, like that running stance.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So like very, very high joint angle. And you would hold it for as long as you can in that long iso. And then the coach would obviously say stop when it's at that point.
Or take the weight off them.
Take the weight off, yeah, exactly. And for example, you could do that between two very low alfongs. Do you know, like this really small like alfong blocks? Like that's a prime example of what I've been using it on.
I love it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that's a good example of that though.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just blown away with your knowledge these days.
You've been saying this lately. I know it's been 12 years.
Yeah, you're right. But it's refreshing.
Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? That it drips in every now and then.
Yeah.
But it's because I've like for me, I've made a conscious effort to, it's not just learning the words, which is what it used to be, by the way. It's actually like, I need to understand this stuff, not like what an alpha block is called, but what happens when the ankle's collapsing, because I need to try and make that decision for the athlete.
Yeah, what's the skill and how does that transfer?
And if I'm honest, initially when I first started doing gym, that isn't what I was doing. I was doing very, very general prep all year round. That was my role, and that was required probably at the time, because you'll know, but as we're starting to look into things in a little bit more detail now, I need to be able to provide maybe that more specific adaptation sometimes as well. Doesn't mean I'm coaching the skills, but I'm trying to coach the physical, the physical side of the problem solving.
Yeah. And I think that was probably one of the most interesting things or useful things for me when we first started working together, was that you would ask me like, what's going on there? Like, because obviously you didn't know gymnastics. So when you were watching something, you didn't know what to look for, which is, understandable.
Yeah.
And you would ask me the question, what is it that you're looking for? Or what's the issue here? And I would say, well, she's not able to do this.
Yes.
And you would say, oh, that's interesting. Let me have a think about that.
Yeah.
Then you would come back with the solution, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much.
Exercise selection or a program or
thought of something.
Yeah, which is like, okay, I think that we could replicate that movement by doing this exercise within their S&C program, which might help kind of overcome the challenge that's being faced there.
Yeah.
Just coming back to, I think when I'm thinking about these yielding exercises, for example, or overcoming exercises, I find my mind's going back to lower limb work.
Cool.
But actually, like we said, blocking off the vault on a Yurchenko is a huge part of a women's artistic program. What can we do to safely express force in that movement? I mean, I think some of the common things that we would do would just have an endurance thing, do a handstand, elevate your shoulders, of course, and maintain that position. Yeah. Maintain that position through bouncing on a springboard in handstands. Yeah. So, but there's not really high amounts of force comparable to what happens when you actually contact the table. Yeah. What do you reckon we could do?
So the kneeling pressing is something I've been using a little bit, like what I'm playing around with.
But it's not inverted, is it? It's not in handstand.
No. You're very much like
the right way up.
Yeah, on planet Earth.
Okay, yeah.
But you then got to consider other things on the shoulder of let's presume we've looked at making sure it's stable, making sure you have very good vertical pressing strength and pulling.
Mobility there. Wrist flexion, for example.
Yeah, you can obviously start to weight some of that yielding work. So your handstand holding in pike, for example, with a weight vest on, you can start to really load that and stress the position in a safe way. That obviously is a manageable weight for the athlete, but obviously we know that it's not an isometric if it breaks down anyway. So if I start to see gaps between shoulders, elbows bending, that would be my visual cue of the weight is too much.
Because that's become an eccentric action, because now they're actually collapsing.
Yeah, it's a failed isometric. Yeah. Is actually the word they use, is like it's a failed isometric action for the yielding stuff, because they're not resisting the breaking point. They've gone past the break in the system, and they're having to use eccentric to control themselves. So that would be another one that we've used as well. So you've got two really good examples there, probably actually, of overcoming, pressing against something like you're trying to lift it off you. Yep. And then obviously the yielding, which is, you're holding and pressing.
I wonder how much stress is caused on wrist, elbow, shoulder through bad technique. So, kids constantly hitting the vault in Yurchenko, but collapsing their arms. I mean, for me, the forces there are going to be significant, right? Like the impact on the shoulder and the elbow with bad technique. So it's a bit not contradictory here, but OCD is quite prevalent with young kids, unfortunately. And I mean, you might correct me on this, but last time I had inquired about this, there wasn't really a definitive answer as to what was leading to OCD. Now, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole now, but I think there's an argument for good technique contact in the vault can actually lead to more forces through the elbow in the sense of I've seen great vaulters at a young age end up with elbow issues because obviously they're striking the vault beautifully.
Right, okay.
So therefore actually the force is, whilst it is being distributed through wrist, elbow and shoulder, there's a high amount of
force that goes through the joint.
Yeah, because they're actually getting the energy transfer from the table.
Yeah.
So instead of leaking energy, they're actually exposed to more energy because the vault's doing its job.
Yeah.
And you know, the idea of good vaulting is that the gymnast does as little as possible and the vault does as much as possible. Yeah. So when you're then exposed to those higher forces because you've hit the vault properly, that's got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And for a young 12-year-old who's contacting the vault with beautiful straight arms,
great stuff.
Yeah, they've now got a lot of force on the elbows. So it's challenging. I think those are the scenarios. Yeah. Maybe this is a bit of a rabbit hole. We should come back. But, you know, this tangent. But essentially, that's why young kids, you know, you've got to not expose them to too many reps, I think, on vault.
Yeah.
Either chuck them out over the vault so it cushions some of that force. If they're contacting the vault beautifully, quit while you're ahead, do a few good reps and move on to something else. You know, otherwise you're going to end up doing more harm than good maybe sometimes.
I've never, amazingly until now, I've not thought of it as that, like, when you do things correctly, you're placing a lot of force through the joint as well, because obviously I'm always looking for, like, if they're not being able to hit that position.
And that's why I was saying it's contradictory.
And you're probably
really
getting both.
Yeah, because I think it's both ends of the spectrum.
I would go for the thing you said last, which was the first thing you said that came to my mind when you said it was, I was like, it's a workload thing.
Yeah, it's a volume thing. Yeah.
So you've got this beautiful vaulter, quit while you're ahead then. So no doubt they'll be training tomorrow or the day after.
Yeah.
They'll be vaulting tomorrow or the day after. So use them sparingly, because that is the piece of apparatus that is going to cause a significant amount of stress on the body and the joints. We know that.
And that's where, like, a T trainer. Yeah. Again, another tumble. Just got the Alphon blocks, which are great, but the T trainer, which is really, an amazing vaulting tool, is what allows the kids to still demonstrate, let's call it textbook technique, without suffering so much through their joints, which is why something like that is so valuable and such a good investment.
Yeah. That's where my mind went, was it's a workload issue. And then I would have actually probably come back with the question of, is there another way for us to get what we want out of this session without them having to do the vault if you think that they're doing too many vaults? Mm-hmm. So it's almost like, can we come up with a solution that allows them to still execute and still get that learning, but without it being another vault, for example, another traditional vault.
Yes, so it's that repetition without repetition, or same but different concept, isn't it? You distribute you want the same amount of volume, but you distribute it in a different way. Exactly. So instead of just doing 15 volts, you do 7 volts, and then you've got, let's say we're going to stick to 15 reps. The remaining 8 reps are going to be of a different activity, which is still useful for the vault, but not got those forces being exposed through the elbow against.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And like, you've spoken about it. I've not put it out yet, but it's the I use the analogy of, it's like the paste is out the tube. So like, if you ever brush your teeth and squeeze too much toothpaste out the tube, you can't put it back in. Right. So it's the same thing as, once you've done too much, like, that then has to be digested by the gymnast. And you're not like putting them back to fight another day. It's the same thing with the pace. It's like, once it's out the tube, that's it. Yeah. Like, you ain't putting it back in. So we've always spoken about how you would almost structure the week, which is a conversation we've had before, which is like making sure you've been sparingly at the beginning, so you haven't squeezed all your pace out your tube, for example. Yeah,
I mean, that happens a lot, isn't it? You come in fresh and the athletes are really able that day. Let's say they've had a day off, or 2 days off, and of course they come back with a lot of energy, which leads to positive training, and then you leverage that too much, and just, not remembering you've still got 5 training days left that week, where you've got to get them to Saturday still with effective training. It's quit while you're ahead sometimes.
Yeah, you don't want to be scraping it through Saturday, Sunday, Friday, whatever it is, because I can imagine we've all been there, where it's Friday and Saturday isn't as fun as that Monday session.
It's all about balance, isn't it? It's hard,
I think so. Yeah, and I think the majority of problems like that sometimes are like workload, I would say.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, can make it difficult.
I've loved this.
Oh yeah, it's been good. Yeah,
we're still scratching the surface, but I mean, it's hopefully the listeners have been able to follow. It's been interesting for them to understand just some of the stuff that we're doing. The conversations that we're having. So rather than us just skirting around the issue of S&C, let's talk deeply about what this actually looks like in performance, and what not just what the exercise selection is, but what's the consideration, the decision making, and yeah, hopefully everyone's found it interesting. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'd love for you to leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought about this content and if you've enjoyed it. But it's been great to have another discussion, and I'm sure we'll be back talking about something else.
Yeah.
S&C related soon.
Yeah, it's cool. No, yeah, thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
Welcome. Thanks, buddy.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Gymnastics Growth Show. Now, if you're an ambitious gymnastics coach with a hunger for self-improvement, check out my Gymnastics Growth Academy, where you'll find members from over 40 countries, all accessing my masterclasses, courses, templates, live community calls, exercise libraries, and so much more. It's a program that members have described as life-changing. So why don't you check it out for yourself? Head to gymnasticsgrowth.com to learn more. See you on the inside.